So as I mentioned, this is the Open Access, Open Research, and Big Deal. I think that's the title, exact title, of this session here. My name is Adam Chesler, and I'm the Global Sales Director at the American Institute of Physics Publishing. And my job here today is to introduce you to the topic at hand and to let our panelists, lead our panelists, I guess, through a series of questions and a discussion about this topic. The whole notion of the big deal, you've heard a lot about it. In fact, it was referenced this morning at one of the plenary sessions. Dates back to the early 90s. And just how many people remember the early 90s? We got a few people? Thank you. I was getting worried. I was worried that there would only be a couple of us left. There was a company called Academic Press, which had put out a package they called Ideal, and they grouped together a bunch of journals and sold them as a package, and off we went. And other publishers obviously adopted that, whether they were big or small. But what's interesting is that depending on who you talk to, you could hear that the big deal was a great deal, or you could hear that it was a raw deal. And I think a lot of perspectives on that have evolved over time. There's still some merit to it. It still offers a lot of access to a lot of content to some institutions which might not ordinarily be able to buy everything, but you're also making sacrifices. You're locking yourself into perhaps a long-term arrangement. So there's pluses and minuses, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about here today. Especially since with the advances in technology, we've got new ways not just to create and access information and distribute it, but also to assess it and to evaluate it. It's no longer about counting how many times a journal gets put back on a shelf. It is ways to actually look at this stuff in more detail. And with that has come the capacity to share research in a lot of different ways, not just the obvious thing like email, but you have preprint servers, you have research collaboration networks, and you might even have a pirate site or two that we can save for another time to discuss. And all of that has led us to question the validity, I think, of a lot of previous assumptions, including the subscription itself. And that's where we get into these conversations about flipping models and moving towards a completely different paradigm where you pay to publish, perhaps, instead of paying to read. And when you look at initiatives that exist like Plan S or OA 2020, which are sort of born in Europe, and if you aren't familiar with those things, I suspect they will come up over the course of this next hour or so, and you'll certainly have opportunities to learn more about them over the course of this conference. There are a number of sessions that will address these things, but what they're doing is forcing the conversation in a certain direction, and what we have to do here is look at what impact could such a substantial shift have on some of the important activities that go under that publishers and other content providers engage in now: registration, certification, preservation. We don't want to necessarily lose everything in the process of shifting to a new model, and we also don't want to create a whole list of a new set of winners and losers in this process, where at one point maybe access becomes available to everybody, but the capacity to publish, because the fees associated with it are too onerous, it becomes difficult to actually share the research itself, as opposed to now where there are maybe people who are cut off from access but have no problems submitting content. How do we balance that? That's part of the thing that we have to tackle here. So we have a group of people here representing a couple of different important constituencies in this community. We've got Chris Bennett from Cambridge University Press. We have Jennifer Chan from the University of California in Los Angeles. And we have Liz Wilson from Wiley. And each of them is going to spend a few minutes giving you some of their perspectives on what they see happening in this day and age. And then they've crafted a whole bunch of questions that they want to address to one another. So they'll have a chance to do the sorts of things that maybe make everybody a little uncomfortable, because we're going to ask each other, how do you address this sort of thing stuff that we usually talk about behind closed doors and not necessarily in front of one another. And when that's all done, there'll be questions that have not yet been asked, and then it'll be your turn. And we'll make sure that we leave some time so that we can address the things that don't get covered in this first section here. So I'm going to leave the floor to just let Chris get us started. So I'm going to grab the microphone there, and off we go.
Adam, many thanks. Can you all hear me okay? Great, thank you. So, Adam, thanks very much for setting the scene. I'm Chris Bennett. I'm the Global Sales Director for Cambridge University Press. Obviously, as a university press, we do have a particular slant on this. We are not a big deal publisher, arguably, as we have a collection of around 400 journals today with a distinct humanities and social science slant, although we are also a growing publisher in the sciences, and that balance has thrown up some of its own challenges in the context of this conversation. But before we get into that, I'm very grateful to Adam for setting the historical context. To comment on that just a little bit more, I think that the situation that we find ourselves in, which is no less than an existential crisis for the methodology around funding scholarly communication, is not new. It's been discussed at this conference year after year. And it's come about because of a confluence of particular factors in the last decade. And in the period immediately after what Adam has described, those first journals packages coming out, we had a move of the same model into the online world and a ramp up of scale as first the larger, then the smaller publishers adopted these models on the same basis, which was that a point of time was set at which holdings spend would be maintained, and then there would be an overlay for growth with an annual increase. And an additional fee for any unsubscribed content is the model that you're all very familiar with. Now, clearly, that is a model that works when it's about stasis, when it's about maintaining revenue at a certain level. It's getting access to everything for everybody, but it assumes that there isn't a great deal of change in the system. What you had in the early 2000s was an overlay of open access publishing on an APC basis, article processing charge, pay for gold OA. And for a long time, those two models essentially coexisted. The problem being that there weren't effective mechanisms to manage OA spend through the institution. There still aren't in many institutions today, and even in countries like the UK, which is looking at a far more radical adoption model of Plan S or variations on the theme at the moment. Still within the institutions, there are often no effective ways of managing OA payments centrally. So you have an overlay of cost and complexity on a system based in the past. And clearly, as we also have, and particularly since the crash of 10 years ago, an acute international library budget crisis, you have the stage set for disruption of this system. And that's exactly where we are today. It's no coincidence that Robert Jan Smits of the European Commission came up with the Plan S principles, which are hybrid journals will be, as he described it, defunded. There will be immediate institutional archiving without embargo period, and so we have a conflation of gold and green open access, which is going to present its own challenges, and everything will be published on a CC BY license. I think we, and I think I'm safe in speaking for Liz at Wiley as well as CUP in this, we see the intent as laudable and right. There has to be a way of resolving this crisis for the good of the academy. There has to be a way to manage a system in which academic career development is predicated upon publishing, and still is and will be for the foreseeable future. And there has to be a way of doing that sustainably so that the spend can be managed through institutions effectively, and that nobody in the supply chain, and I very much include publishers in this, nobody is taking advantage of that system to its detriment. And that is not universally true today. This is the point at which we need to work together on an effective transition from a failing, cumbersome, overly complex model to something that is going to work for publishing as well as reading in the future. And it's getting from here to there which is going to present us with the greatest challenge, not the destination, which is something we have a community of interest in achieving. Jennifer.
Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me? Should I move this closer? All right. Better now? Okay. So thank you, Adam, for the introduction. And yes, I am a librarian. I'm actually a scholarly communication librarian at UCLA. But I've been reminded to dutifully issue my disclaimer, which is that the views and opinions expressed by me on this panel do not necessarily represent the official position or policy of the University of California, nor the UCLA Library. We have a queen of the big deal for the University of California. She's sitting up here in front. That's Ivy Anderson. So if you're looking for that perspective, you might get that from her later. So my experiences as a professional librarian in really large research institutions like UCLA has long been coupled with a collection development or collection management perspective. So at UCLA, the portfolio for collection management and scholarly communication actually sit together under one AUL. And that's actually been the case since the mid-noughts, so it's been that way for a while now. Chris brought up one of the issues about assessment of investment, really, for institutions. And one of the things that we really want to look at is where should we be putting the finite amount of dollars that we have in terms of institutional local investments, not just in big deals or decoupling from big deals, but also in looking at these other opportunities. So in my capacity as a member of California's Scholarly Transformation Advice and Review team, that's the STAR team, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but we actually look at and evaluate whether or not to make recommendations for initial investment at the UC level system. So that's one way that we're really looking at this issue across the UCs. But more narrowly, I sit on our Collections Council at UCLA, where we're looking at investments at the local level, which can further enrich or support the teaching and learning and research of our scholars as well as our students. So we're looking at a number of different approaches to really evaluating whether or not we should be continuing in the types of investments or deals that we're making. But apart from that, I think that it's definitely true that all of us are grappling with the question of what do we do in terms of supporting open access. Certainly all of us at the UC, I think, are philosophically aligned in terms of believing that we should support open access, although there are many different approaches to that. So in that vein, I think we're looking at what the institution maybe can do locally, as well as what we can do in participation in our consortial and larger agreements at the multi-institution or the system level.
Great, and I'll do the same check. Can you hear me? Yes, better. Thank you, Jennifer, Chris, and Adam. I'm Liz Ferguson. I've worked at Wiley now for the past 15 years, and my current responsibilities are all around open access. I lead our open access business development and strategy. I've come to that from a very sort of traditional editorial and publishing background, so I don't have the depth that Chris and Adam and Jennifer have in the challenges that have faced institutions over the course of the past 20 years. I've been very aware of them, but I'm not fully grounded in them. But it's certainly true to say that over the last 2 to 3 years in particular, I've been brought much more closely to those. And I was asked to give the perspective of a large sort of mixed model publisher in the kind of discussion that we're having today, and to talk a little bit about how we're seeing the future and how we're seeing getting to that future. And I would entirely endorse what Chris said earlier. I think we all share the same destination, and I might come back to that in a little bit. the biggest challenge is in how we get there and how we work together to get there in a sustainable way that makes sense for all of us in this room, but also the huge body of researchers that we all have to serve day in and day out. Now, clearly, the developments, particularly but not exclusively in Europe, are driving change at a pace that we have not seen up until very recently. And the very strong pushes that we're seeing coming through from Plan S and most recently from Wellcome and Gates as well, I think are sort of the ultimate expression of frustration in the pace of change that's been delivered to date. Having said that, there has been change. There has been development both on the institutional side and on the publisher side in the way that we approach big deals, but also the kind of interaction between subscription and open access over the course of the past few years. Our own work in this began in 2015 with a significant offset model that we worked on with JISC in the UK. We, like others, now have some blended or transitional deals that play in a number of countries within Europe. And the three of us were talking actually just ahead of this. And this is one of the points I hope that illustrates the work we all have to do to bring researchers with us, is that even when researchers have the opportunity to publish open access under the terms of these deals at no cost to themselves, the take-up rate is anywhere between, and I'm talking industry-wide now, not specifically to Wiley, anywhere between about 60 and 95%. And I think we do have to ask questions about what it is we can all do in this transition period to motivate researchers to take advantage of the opportunities that we are all collectively investing in. So from my perspective, the groundwork is laid. It may not be a strong enough foundation for many yet, or we may not be sort of piling up the bricks fast enough on top. But the challenges that lie in getting those bricks to move a bit faster are really quite deeply entrenched for all of us. We're currently spending a lot of time, and when I use the term we and ours right now, I'm talking partly about Wiley, but also the publishing industry in general, and Chris can disagree with me later if he chooses. We're all investing significant amounts of money in the infrastructure that's needed to deal with open access at a much greater scale than we've experienced it before. So the infrastructure I'm talking about, again, is the kind of infrastructure that improves and simplifies the author experience as much as possible as they go through the process, so they understand both their rights but also their obligations when it comes to licensing choices and so on. I'm also talking about the kind of infrastructures that suit increasing numbers of institutions and funding bodies as they come on board with direct relationships with publishers, so that they understand the levels of uptake within their own institutions, what causes success, what might need tweaking for the future. And I know there's a lot of emphasis within institutions right now on much more data-driven approaches to understanding what's happening with faculty output. This kind of infrastructure, I think, will help us all. We've also been taking our own very data-driven approach to this environment, Wiley and other publishers besides. You can imagine the extent of modeling that has been created within publishers over the course of the past 12 to 24 months, and the revised modeling that went on in response to Plan S emerging. There are real challenges for everyone in making those changes. The average amount of output for Plan S at Wiley is about 4%. It's significantly higher for other publishers, or significantly lower, and therefore not likely to have the impact that perhaps is imagined with the current level of funding signatories. So that in itself creates a lot of complexity to deal with, and complexity does not make for a very efficient system. So we need to find ways to try to iron out some of the complexity over the course of the next few years. What I can see as a non-salesperson, not grounded in the background of what's been going on with big deals, is a lot of continued experimentation and change. So far, no one single customer, consortia, whatever, who I've been involved in discussions with has wanted precisely the same thing, and no one publisher is offering precisely the same thing, and no mix of publishers is offering precisely the same thing. It might help if we could align things a little bit more closely, but also while we're going through this period of experimentation, I think the best thing for us all to do is be willing to be more open than perhaps we might have been in the past, certainly on the publisher's side, and be willing to share the lessons that we learn, the mistakes that we make, or the changes that we can make to make sure that there is as much value as possible being gained from the system. I also think there's going to be a continued evolution of the model. It's obvious that publishing services can be layered in on top of the big deal. It's already happening. It's obvious that publishing services in the framework of some deals might start to diminish what is being spent on subscriptions. If we think about that further, it's possible that access models may change, that there is a much more data-driven approach being taken. I know this was the theme of an earlier talk today, to collections management within the context of a more open future as well, is one possibility. There's potential for Netflix-type arrangements where there's access to a great big database of content, and I'm slightly aware of saying this in this room, but maybe there isn't perpetual access to that if the subscription content and the right to read is not seen as having quite the same value as it once did in a world where everyone is on this transition to open. So there's lots of different potential out there for change. I hope that we can all work together in getting to the position that we want to. It's not going to be a straightforward one when we get there because APC models still don't suit everybody. Platinum is not going to answer for the needs of those who don't work with gold APCs, and the mix of green and gold is complex. But I think there's some interesting challenges ahead for everyone to resolve together.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you, for sort of fleshing out some of the things that we're going to now dive into. And before we go any further, I do want to thank Kelly O'Rourke from Cambridge University Press, who, as you hear these questions come along, she's the one who helped pull all this together and put them in one place, which is certainly making my life easier. And I always thank people when they do that for me, so thank you. We'll start. I'm just going to go in order here, and it's open to the group, so feel free to jump in as you wish. From your view, where are we in the evolution of journals purchasing and the big deal? How far along are we on this path? Are we a third of the way? Are we halfway? Are we 90% of the way? Are we 1%? Where does all this fit, and when are we going to get there, basically?
Well, speaking from our perspective, and I think that our perspective is going to be rather different from Liz's, certainly, as a different scale and type of publisher, we're not very far along this path yet, really. What's happened is that the big deal has staggered on year to year. It's clung on by its fingernails, it's survived, and as we've said already, a certain number of other things have been layered in over it. What's happening in Europe at the moment is shifting this paradigm dramatically, and particularly in the Netherlands, which was the first to go with this, we now have a deal there, and the details of this are freely available online at the pages managed by the VSNU, the funding body in the Netherlands. You can see the details of all of the publisher deals, which covers unlimited, in our case, open access publishing, as well as subscription spend for a period of years. And we are seeing uptake of similar deals on the same principle. We've agreed those now with the DFG, that's the funder in Germany, and with BIBSAM, the consortium in Sweden. Others will follow. So they are moving rapidly to a point of envisaging a transition from pay to read to pay to publish. And we're certainly going to end up with a very mixed economy, even in those systems that have moved. The problem is, of course, that you can't have success at this, and the great irony of this all being about scholarly communication across borders, driven by the potential for open research. You can't have one part of the world moving when you have one of the greatest, now the second greatest producer here, the US, taking a largely green approach to this and continuing so far, for the most part, along a more classic big deal path. So actually, very little change here to date. There is talk, there hasn't been a great deal of action. We're going to have a massively unbalanced system. And I think Adam mentioned winners and losers. there's the potential here for escalating cost and very uneven publishing capability across these different global markets over the next few years. In the session earlier on today, the panel from Viva also mentioned China. And China now, as of June this year, overtook the US, not just in speed of growth, but in quantity of research output. Only just, but China is driving an agenda of paying its authors by the state to publish in international journals, and blocking the career progression of those who don't. It's a classically Chinese model, given the current Chinese government. So we've got a totally different perspective coming to the fore there. We're starting to see fragmentation. This isn't moving us along the road.
So I know that librarians have been saying that maybe the big deal is dead, or that we were claiming that it was dying for almost a decade now, actually. But I do think that it's actually increasingly the case that many are willing to really look at their big deal packages these days and maybe step away from those packages with the data that they have about usage, data that they have about demand, about readership. Those types of analytics that we now have available are really, I think, both changing some of the collection development strategies that we're taking, as well as looking and encouraging new ways for negotiation and really reassessing how we're taking on those types of responsibilities. So I think we're maybe in the more talk, but also now maybe more action as well. So I know that in a few years past, University of California system did break their big deal with Taylor and Francis. We have perhaps recently gotten back together again, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been some changes as a result of those types of actions and packages. And I think we're seeing more willingness on the part of institutions here in the US to really look at their packages and analyze whether or not those packages are meeting the demands, both of their researchers as well as of the library's ability to support the type of resources that our scholars are increasingly telling us that they're needing. And some of those categories of outputs are not necessarily in the scholarly article anymore, so we're having to invest or maybe focus on other areas of emerging resources and really looking at data packages, other research environment support types of tools. So maybe it's not dead yet, the big deal, but maybe we're much closer than we said we were about 10 years ago.
Okay, thank you. I think one area of minor disagreement I might have with Chris is that we're much further ahead than necessarily Cambridge is. The amount of talk, I guess, and speculation around driving to this much more open access future is not yet matched by the pace of real change in terms of the deals that are actually or have been completed. Let's not say are in process, but have been completed. For us, it's currently 3. And they're significant and they're important and they set us on a trajectory for the future. But it's not as if all of our research output or even anywhere close to 10% of it is yet covered by those kinds of transitional arrangements. I think where are we generally on this trajectory of breaking away from the big deal? There are some, depending on the way you look at it, in some respects, these transitional deals could be seen as consolidating even further the big deal to some respects. If you look at what Germany is trying to achieve right now, Germany is talking to the 3 largest publishers only currently, and they're talking about, as well as the very significant change they want in the publishing environment and the aggressive way in which they want to pursue an open future, they want access to all of the subscription content that those 3 publishers publish in all of the major, not just major, all of the research institutions in Germany. That has the effect, potentially, of cementing content into those institutions from the rest of the world that hasn't yet got onto that trajectory. So I certainly see the trajectory moving faster from here on in, but it's starting from a very small base, even for those of us that have been engaging with it for the past 3 or 4 years.
You guys are welcome to engage one another if you...
Well, I have to say, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference between Liz and I on that. I agree. We've done a certain number of these deals in Europe, There is a tremendous political will at the moment, but there aren't the real mechanisms in place to scale this currently, and there won't be until much more of the world, particularly in North America, gets involved in actively making this happen. Otherwise, we're just going to have a huge disparity in approach.
Yeah, I think the challenge is how do we get there without a lot of people falling off a cliff? And I suspect Mynheer Smits might say, if it's a brutal process, so be it. It's time. But I wonder if there are people at the top levels of academic institutions who would agree, and I know that there are people at publishing institutions who would dispute, say that that's a good thing. But that's the challenge, isn't it? Is we're not moving in lockstep yet. How do we get in sync when you've got these disparate approaches in the Americas, in Asia Pacific, and in Europe? But that leads us to a second question. I think it segues nicely. If the big deal is done, what will the subscription model of the future look like? Will it be cheaper? Will it be based on something other than titles and article counts? I think it's interesting that the word subscription even shows up in this question, because you could wonder if that's even a concept that will exist as we move forward. And how will we do this? Are we just going to rebalance the money? Are we going to take the exact same amount of money and simply shift who buys and who spends it and how? Or are we actually going to see a change in how much money is put into the system, whether for more or less?
So it looked as if the mic was moving inexorably back in this direction then, so I'm going to have to try and tackle that one. We're going to have a mixed economy here for some considerable time. In fact, it's fair to talk about the foreseeable future here, particularly in the humanities and social sciences subjects. And Liz mentioned earlier the difficulty of author take-up on the new model, APC, or let's just for a moment consider a world in which we transcend the APC, which personally I think is much more interesting as a future, and we really start to try and move spend from subscription to publish. And that is going to take a lot of time in subjects where there isn't just lack of take-up for this, there's active hostility towards it. And particularly, for instance, amongst historians who don't only have a philosophical problem with the model, they dislike the type of Creative Commons licenses being used as well. So we're actually going to see divergence within the academy and within institutions over this. And if we do effect transitional models, then those, I think, in whole areas of discipline and certainly in geographical areas, are going to stay quite firmly grounded in subscription spend for some time. Then there is the question of, which I think Adam alluded to there as well, in that multi-level question, which I'm now grappling with, how to make that spend more effective. And something we hear time and time again, and certainly I heard frustration from the panel from Viva earlier today too, the amount of money you're being asked for per year by publishers, those high annual increases, which clearly in this environment are even less sustainable when you've got the layering of OA costs on top of that. So to answer that part of the question, I do think we need to look at that total universe of spend and say, well, let's agree that that spend is maintained, but it's distributed very differently between read and publish for the future, and that we have a period of time where not only do we work on a transition, we learn from what that transition is telling us about levels of publishing, levels of author take-up by institution and indeed by market, and then we look at what that tells us about redistribution. And there might be some significant losers in that, and particularly where we look at markets like India, which have tremendous research output potential, which is not yet realized, they are predominantly consumers rather than producers. How does this work for them? Something else to throw in here, and Liz alluded to this, I think this is a fantastic point. Do you as libraries want to continue to own everything you buy? Could you draw down from a cloud base of content that gives you access to what you need, not necessarily in perpetuity, whatever that means? Have a look at your contracts. So is there a different way of looking at it from your point of view? And are the ways that your budget's structured holding you to a print-based past unhelpfully? And the breaking of the big deal, the real big deal, could free up entirely new ways of looking at this, which are not just about open access, but they are about wide access, affordable and sustainable access. And that could be transformational in terms of the flexibility it gives you and the amount of money available back into the whole ecosystem.
So my response is not directly in contrast with Chris's. However, I think in terms of whether or not subscriptions are going away, I think we're seeing subscription models being applied to other types of content. So not necessarily to serials or things of that nature anymore. And so in that respect, I kind of hope that we're not going to see a broadening of subscriptions to tools like research data packages and things like that, because I don't think that that necessarily allows for an environment that fosters open scholarship and open research. But I do think that there's now increasing levels of complexity, as Chris alluded to, in terms of packages, in terms of types of packages, in terms of what we're actually buying, for how long, what we can use it for. All of those types of questions really being wrapped up into individual decisions being made about specific resources. So I think maybe we'll continue to see the subscription. We'll see it for big deal packages, but maybe the packages won't be as big as they were in the past. And maybe we'll be making different decisions in terms of how long we'll be holding on to those packages. I do certainly think and am largely a proponent of perpetual access, but I guess it also depends on a lot of conditions that we might see a researcher using that type of information and that type of research in order to support and generate new research. So while I'm certainly a favor of perpetual access, I think maybe there's some argument to be made about whether or not there might be times when that can be a concession that we discuss. In terms of whether or not we can really look at kind of this transitional period of OA and what it means here, I think it's a largely different environment in the US than it is in the UK. And so I think with that being said, there's also different institutional demands that maybe consortia have to take into account in terms of their different consortial partners. So maybe it's not as much a case that we're all speaking in one voice, but I don't know that that necessarily bodes for a bad thing. Sometimes diversity of voices can bring out potential new solutions to issues that we're all grappling with. So
Thank you. So I guess my answer to the first question or first part of the question of will the subscription even exist is yes, but not as we know it. And I think Chris and Jennifer have done a good job of describing why. The second part of can we just shift the money, I think is not a question that solely publishers can answer. Chris has described already how there are many different circumstances, geographically speaking, but also in terms of discipline. And that affects where the money actually is. I know from some meetings I've had recently that certain bodies within China are looking at a future of much more open access with rather wide eyes because they're concerned about their ability to pay for having become the world's largest research producer. They came later to the subscription market than those in this room and those in Europe did. So their spend relative to the value they're getting now there's a much greater value proposition in there for them than there is in paying article by article for publication under a gold model. So that's a real challenge for places like China and India that are far greater research producers now and in future. It's also, I think, a real challenge for the research-intensive institutions. And this was a fairly big topic of conversation probably 3 years ago, and I know still is. Can the balance shift from subscription to publishing within the context of an individual deal? Yes, probably. Is that shift of expenditure always going to be enough that those research-intensive producers are claiming and paying for their share at whatever level in a new world in which there is much greater paying for publishing rather than reading, is something that I think we're all trying to grapple with and struggle with. The levels of expenditure on the read side of things is not necessarily where the balance of expenditure is going to fall on the published side of things. And I'd also say that what has really enabled the transition to even start to take place, whether it's fast enough or not is a moot point, has been funders' willingness to engage with this issue. Wellcome has been far and away the most successful at introducing, supporting, and implementing a gold paid-for open access policy. We all know they've changed that in the last couple of days. But that's because they embedded it in every single thing that they were doing and made the funds available in order to make that happen. The UK generally, with the funds that were made available by the government to RC UK, who knows what's going to happen, some point in the middle of next year, are what has enabled UK research output, at least with Wiley, to now be more than 25% of it is available on a fully open access basis. So the shifting money isn't simply a question of can we divert X $100,000 worth of subscription expenditure within a single deal to X $100,000 worth or X 100,000 plus Y to publishing expenditure within a certain deal. It's a question of whether the money is in the right place to start with when we look at it respective to the endpoint.
I think that leads us to our next question very nicely, which is how would the end of the big deal impact publishing itself? In particular, smaller journals without the recognition of larger brands. You could be talking about some journals that are published by some societies which don't have the bandwidth or the scale to manage some of these, not just the changes, but the change itself. How are we going to accommodate all the different ways that content is delivered in these packages, whether they're big deals or just a single title, in an environment where we move away from this model which is currently supported them? The big deal tends to support the introduction of a lot of journals. There are a lot of people who will say, this isn't a good thing. Mm-hmm. Duly noted. The question is, for you folks, what's the impact going to be? Is it going to be for the better, or is it going to be for the worse if we move away from this mechanism for introducing a lot of new content quickly and, let's put this in quotes, efficiently?
Efficiently as well. Okay, that makes it even more challenging. The big deal has undoubtedly benefited smaller journals and the researchers who read the content published within those smaller journals. And I think one consequence I would not like to see from the end of the big deal is that it becomes harder for researchers in niche disciplines who have a journal that represents their very core research interest to not be accessible to them at the point in which they need it. Some of those journals could completely thrive in an open access world, some of them may not. But if we're just talking about it as a consequence of the end of the big deal, I do have concerns about the potential for some of those journals to be able to reach their core audiences at the right time. That's potentially where these alternative mechanisms of access come into play, when there's I am probably going to get myself into deeper water than I know how to answer here from a non-sales perspective, but more usage-based models, or the kind of drawdown from the cloud at the point you need it, access to a database, but perhaps without all of the other rights that have been or some of the other rights that have traditionally been associated with subscriptions. That at least enables those journals to continue serving the needs of the researchers as and when they need want to access them. And enables researchers to continue publishing because they have confidence that their own communities can get access to those resources as and when they want them as well.
To illustrate the point Liz just made, look at mathematics, in which we're a very strong publishing presence. This is an area of STM, but it's an area that behaves in a very niche manner, much more like a social science. And you've got low usage niche journals which do not have a clear economic model in this new world, but are absolutely key to the development of the communities that are supported by them. So this gets very complicated. Now, I'd like to think that we're in a world in which a relevant, high-impact journal effectively earns its keep. But of course, the nature of journals, their success, their scale, has changed over time. And we have journals at the moment which have done very, very well from the big deal model over decades, because it's locked in the spend that they used to have when subscriptions were in a far more healthy place than they would be today. Those journals, if they haven't kept up, if they don't have the quality and frequency of publishing, they don't have the relevance perhaps, they've become bloated. Some of them and some of those societies have become greedy, although I wouldn't want that to be a generalization, because most societies work really hard on behalf of their communities and they put the money back in. But there is, again, disparity between societies. Liz hinted at something there which I think could be a way forward for this, which is that we divorce the sales model from the allocation model back to the society, which could be done on a number of factors. One of those most certainly would be usage, and that's a way of redistributing that wealth back to journals that are earning it. But again, you'd need a transition period which ran in parallel with, but was not the same as, the transition of the market-facing model for sales, making this question even more vexed. We will have to look at that. We have already started talking to our principal societies about what this future holds for them, and about our responsibility for taking them along that road. But we are in an environment in which some of the funders see societies as at best a squeezed middle here. At worst, are just not interested in them, and therefore are completely unaware or simply uninterested in the value that they're giving back to the academic community, which could be a poor outcome for researchers in those areas, something we're going to have to balance very, very carefully.
So I don't know that one necessarily results in the product of the other. In other words, that the dissolution of the big deal necessarily means that we see smaller journals going away. I think we've looked at and we've observed the development of increasing academy-owned publication. So there may be new homes in an open access landscape for that type of resource and those types of journals. And I think we're also seeing that there's been an evolution in not only the discovery techniques and platforms and tools that could be able to be used to find such content, but also in really those methods that researchers are going about in terms of finding the sources that they need for that information. So not a complete pushback, but I do think that there is room more in this space for some of these other journals. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will die without a big deal.
Chris, you mentioned how we would assign value to different publications and cited usage, and I suppose it's worth pointing out that while usage is an interesting component, I think we would all agree that there's a lot of holes in it too. 20 downloads by someone who's looking at a syllabus and saying, oh, I better get everything on my computer here, is not necessarily worth the same as one download from a PhD researcher who actually uses that article, and it doesn't account for negative use where you've ruled things out even though you didn't necessarily download them. So there could be value in just seeing the articles up there. A lot of questions, and we can get into journal impact factors and other ways of these assessments, and they all have holes. How do we fill them, or how do we work, put enough of it together so the holes aren't so big is one of the challenges, I think, there. We've talked a lot, and this tends to happen quite frequently when we get into discussions about scholarly content, we've tended to lean towards the STEM content. So one of the questions that we should probably make sure we address, sorry, the type is too small, hang on, is what will the impact for consumer nations institutions, what will be the impact for consumer nations institutions in the new OA landscape And more importantly, what will be the impact for varying disciplines like the humanities and social sciences? Because you mentioned the math journals that you folks publish, and we all talk about how much money goes into research for the physical sciences, for the biological sciences, et cetera. There's a whole different way of thinking about publishing and distributing information when you get to the humanities and the social sciences. How's that going to fit into this? We don't want to leave that behind. We don't want to omit it. How's that work? And you guys both publish lots of humanities journals, so you probably can speak to this.
I can speak to a little bit of it. It's definitely not something that has very clear answers right now. And Chris mentioned earlier that there is some active pushback from scholars in certain communities as well on the principles of moving to open access. They don't like the licensing regimes or whatever it might be. There is a huge challenge for the humanities, in particular in this space, that journals tend to have many fewer articles published in them each year. That certainly isn't going to lend itself to a sustainable APC model, especially not given the intensity of the review work that needs to go on into that kind of work and the degree of support that's needed for the editorial offices and so on. I think Jennifer's point that she just made about academy-owned journals is a really interesting one. I also can see other models out there that if we assume we're at the end point where the world is open and humanities are a part of that open world, we can see things like Knowledge Unlatched working. We can see the experiments that the annual review series are beginning to undertake around different forms of support that enables content that doesn't lend itself well to APC-driven open access, and how they may be supported in the longer term while still enabling this open future that we're looking for. But it's certainly true, I would say, that our partners in the humanities are more concerned. All of our partners, society partners I'm talking about now, are concerned about the implications of the sort of more aggressive plans being laid out right now. Humanities more so than anybody else. It's been a fairly sharp kind of jolt into the future for them. And we need to help them get through that as best we can. I'm not sure entirely what the answer is yet. It's fairly easy to see if you look at the desired end goal of something like Plan S, for example, which is a much faster acceleration of titles flipped entirely to open access. That might work quite well in biotechnology, even if there's only a small proportion of authors covered by Plan S funders or others who are supporting gold open access. You can see an ability for researchers in China or whatever to come in and pay APCs to be able to publish. It's going to be interesting to see how the zero embargo green requirement plays out. That, to me, introduces potentially an option. It's one I'm not personally keen on for the humanities, but it also allows for complexity elsewhere in the system by trying to run through some countries or major consortia a desire to get to gold and a full flip on a gold basis, while others want to do green, and research is still a global endeavor. So I've started to get off the topic of humanities, so I will stop.
So again, with due caution for speaking about HSS as an amorphous mass, because it isn't, and there are going to be significant differences in models adopted within the disciplines that come under that collective heading. This really is an area, I think, where, as Liz has suggested, we need to make the vehicle available for open access publishing. We need to be prepared to transition the spend that's currently coming from subscriptions into maintaining these titles in an OA world. But we can't force those communities to drive that vehicle. We can only make it available. Until the time comes that they wish to do so, this is going to be, I think, very much part of this mixed economy, which is maintained to a significant extent by subscriptions. There is less pressure on it, I feel, because the price points concerned are so much lower than they are in the sciences, and it's an acceptable mechanism for funding publishing in many of the HSS subjects, whereas increasingly it's not in the sciences. Having said that, we should talk about, and Liz has mentioned knowledge unlatched, we should talk about working with the institutions, and there often are groups of institutions who are driving particular subjects together, working with those around the world in what could effectively be new consortia to fund this sort of publishing in OA. So a completely different model that works for these communities would be something of real interest. And again, that would have to transcend the idea of the APC, the one fee, one article model, for it to be successful. But it could be something very different.
Certainly, I agree on the it could be something very different part, especially if we take into account that in many cases, humanities and social science researchers have expressed sort of a frustration at the lack of open access options in terms of their fields. If they're not interested in just producing a monograph, or if they're not interested in publishing in one of a handful of HSS journals, what are the other options in terms of the open access landscape? So I think as we see other research output types develop, and as we see more support for being able to make those types of resources available to researchers and to the general public, I think we'll see an evolution of interest, specifically among humanities and social sciences. But I also think that in some cases, it's just really, there is also that frustration of lack of venue. And in some cases, in addition to that, there's also different types of information, in quotation marks, that get passed around about concerns potentially that might affect this particular discipline or this set of disciplines more than others. I know that was something that I heard when I was at the University of Colorado Boulder and trying to advocate for an open access policy. There were just concerns about open access in general that were kind of different for humanities and social science researchers, mainly because many of their colleagues had not been exposed to OA previously. And so there was a lot of questions more so than information in that area. So I think this is also an issue where there's opportunity as well as a need for education, and maybe really assessing what the needs are for these researchers, that maybe it's not just a monograph, maybe it's not just a research article anymore.
We are getting close to 2 o'clock, and while there are still some questions on this list here, I do want to make sure we have time for you folks to ask some questions. So before I roll further through this list here, I'd like to invite members of the audience to come up and ask any questions. I think is there a microphone back there? Okay. So please step up to the microphone, and we ask that you identify yourself and provide your affiliation, because context is important. And what have you got for us?
Hi.
Go ahead.
I'm Julia Gelfand from the University of California at Irvine. I'm just sort of interested in why the three panelists failed to address the potential for the big deal to follow some other retail options that we see in the marketplace, such as cars that are on the lot for a long time, or the current real estate market that we're seeing taking a dive today. Why isn't the price of the big deal coming down big time to attract libraries to invest in it? I'm not suggesting they would take that offer or why they haven't, but when you say libraries want ease of purpose, they're stretched with manpower issues, and they'd like to keep business in-house. And so if you had access at a price point that was far more attractive than the negotiations that have been to date, that reflect just bigger and bigger and going up and up, libraries might entertain it. I'm not saying that that's an answer, but I was just sort of interested in that retail sense, why that hasn't. And related to that is from an author's point of view or an editor's point of view, not everyone wants to be a publisher. So the whole idea of open access, ready for everything, some content might be better served because of the value added that publishers provide, and everybody thinks of that as reinforcement. But at a price point now, with different tools available in different segments, as Ivy alluded to in her remarks this morning, of how consortia and how libraries collectively are addressing that, is pushing the envelope that I don't see the commercial publishers or scholarly publishers embracing to that extent, to invite in those authors to do that. except in an APC option. So if you could kind of address that in those business models, I'd be really curious to see what you think. Thank you.
Sure, so I'll say that I'm definitely in favor of lower prices for big deals.
And you know what? So am I. Now, bear in mind where I'm coming from. CUP, arguably, as I've said this already today, is not a big deal publisher. We're also a potential beneficiary of the existing system changing radically. So I don't speak without self-interest in this. I do think that price gouging and tying institutions into years of spend on an as was, not as is or as will be basis with unsustainable levels of increase per year is outrageous. I do think that that has got to stop. But if you consider what that money's doing for the community and the fact that the whole process of academic career advancement is built on this, we've got to find a way of getting from there to that future. We've got to effect a transition. In the humanities and social sciences, I think that there's a meaningful opportunity now for exactly the sort of thing you're describing. And I don't think that it's going to be supported by an APC model that just builds more cost on top of what there is already. I think that those costs inevitably are going to come down for the greater good. I think that there is going to be much more of a reckoning in the sciences.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm entirely in a position to agree with the fact that I think that the price of the big deal should come down. And you would probably expect me to say that. I think over time, there are problems with it. I entirely accept that. And there are also problems with the fact that library budgets are as constrained as they are and have been as constrained as they have been for so many years now. We still see continued demand for our publishing from authors in our subscription program as much as we do in open access. So while our open access output is growing tremendously right now, our subscription output continues to grow. Last year, it was nearly 10% increase in output across Wiley overall. I think by and large, we're able to also demonstrate increasing value in the usage that people are getting from the subscription content that's provided to them. I'm not saying that as an attempt to justify the sort of outrageous price hikes that Chris referred to that might have taken place in the past. I guess I am saying it in an attempt to justify the value that is gained from those. However, I would also agree that there is a need for a bit of a reckoning both on the value that is derived from big deals, and I have no doubt at all that institutions hold us to account on that in a lot of our conversations. The conversations I've been having around here focus much more, for example, on the consequences of double dipping than I ever hear in Europe these days as a means of bringing down the total cost of expenditure. And I also entirely agree we have to find different ways of engaging with researchers for whom APC-driven publishing or cost-based publishing is not the best solution. By discipline, absolutely, but also in terms of geography, we need to do a much better job at engaging with researchers in the global south who, in some cases, in some periods when their economies are doing well, are actually quite able and willing to support APC-based publishing or other cost-based publishing activities driven by them. The minute the economy tanks, it becomes completely out of reach, and that's not going to be sustainable for those communities in the long term.
Hello there, it's Robert Harrington from the American Mathematical Society. I have a comment and a question. The comment, maybe this is something we can take up at a later stage, but there was a comment about, I think from Chris, about societies being squeezed out. Maybe that's referring perhaps to societies you partner with. We're an independent society, and I think that's worthy of exploration because societies do a lot of good for the communities. And the question is, how come that those who are the funding bodies and others don't recognize that? Is that indeed true? So that perhaps that's something to take outside of this. The question I actually had for you three was, could you could you all list a couple of potential unintended consequences of a potential divide between the US and Europe as Read and Publish and Plan S potentially takes hold? Because I'm just wondering what the unintended implications may be, and have you thought about any of those potential scenarios?
One of those, certainly for the humanities, would be loss of revenue going back to those communities from the consumer rather than producer nations. And linked to that, the possibility of the model becoming distinctly Western-centric. And I think those are the two things I would point to as real danger areas in an unbalanced shift.
I think the biggest unintended consequence I'm concerned about with the very US-European type question that you posed is that research, I've made this point a couple of times already, is a genuinely global and collaborative effort. If what some of Europe is currently trying to achieve in a transition to a full gold-based APC flip doesn't have corresponding support from researchers, funders, particularly, I guess, in the US, then you're forcing collaborators to make differing decisions about the publishing options that are available to them. And that just creates more complexity, more difficulty, more challenge in something that is already not easy to do. I'm also concerned, by the way, about that divide between the UK that is currently part of Europe and the UK that will not be part of Europe in the same respect. So the unintended consequences at their worst to me are consequences that interfere with the research process and the way that researchers choose to collaborate, publish, and so on. I wanted to address really quickly your point about whether funding bodies do or don't recognize the value of societies. They do, but a number of those that we're engaging with right now, especially around some of the latest developments, believe quite strongly that research dollars shouldn't be supporting the other very valuable activities that societies drive. They feel that if there's value to those, societies should be able to generate the money from elsewhere. I'm not saying I agree with that, and it's the perspective that I'm hearing.
So I think another potentially unintended consequence that we're really already seeing some effects of has to do with the labor of peer review and the representation of peer review in terms of which scholars are actually doing the bulk of the peer review and then which scholars are actually being published. I think as we see a difference in the geography for the representation of who's publishing, we won't necessarily see that shift in who's doing the peer review. And so we'll get a greater imbalance there in terms of the evaluators and the actual publishing.
Anybody else? We still have some time here.
I'll go back because I thought you had asked all my questions. It's a simple question. In the discussions that have been going on for many years between various parties about open access, like the Finch process in the UK, for example, it's always been the assumption that open access will be total and global. And yet nobody ever questions this, except you have just now. One of you has. But the advantages of total open access are obviously very great because that's total and everything is available. But is it actually practical?
Define practical?
Such a simple question, Anthony.
Yes.
Right now, it's not practical. It's not practical because of the great irony that, as we've said already, researchers want to work across boundaries for laudable aims for the good of humanity. And I think we've all made that point in our different ways today. However, you don't need to look at the political backdrop anywhere in the world for very long to see, and Liz has just referenced Brexit, that we're becoming increasingly divided into blocks. We have really parochial ways of handling funding in scholarly comms, budgetary processes, as we've suggested in the institution and even nationally, follow a print-based traditional model for this. Moving into a truly open world is going to take a lot of practical change. And at the moment, we're only just at the start of that process. And I think this is going to need cross-border collaboration between the funders of research, between governments, to make it work. And currently what we're seeing is governmental self-interest, indifference, or lack of knowledge of the subject completely. So there's a long way to go.
Okay, I think I might take the simple way out of your simple question, Anthony, by saying at some point, yes, it will be practical. And I think we're at the beginning of seeing an acceleration to the point at which it will become practical. But I would hazard a hypothesis that many of us in this room will be retired by the time we get to that practical endpoint. It will happen because that's what there is clear motivation and a lack of technological barriers to enabling it to happen. There's a lack of pragmatism at the moment in terms of helping us get to that point.
Can I just say that I'm pretty committed to the open agenda, actually. But I'm not a publisher anymore. I'm a researcher, actually. And I've been interviewing early career researchers for the last 3 years. And all of them, almost with an exception, are committed in principle to the open agenda, sharing, openness, transparency. There's a tiny number that are not, and we're going right across the world here. But I think the funders are pushing it too much. And one of the reasons is they're not talking to anybody. If I talk to Liber, for example, any Liber people here? Liber says, I mean, I know quite a number of people involved closely in Liber. I say, when you push forward something which eventually became S, did you talk to the researchers? I said this to somebody. Why should we do that? What we're interested in is the innovation helping European industry to beat up the Americans. Can you imagine that in terms of what we're talking about? But this is what people are thinking, what they're thinking. I mean, the welcome is slightly different, but the other people are. And so that worries me a great deal. I think we have to have, that's why I'm keen on the Open Scholarship Initiative. I think we all should all be talking, which you are. This is an interesting panel because you are talking. But it's got to be it's going to be a difficult thing to work out. You can't just stab the other person and hope their blood will somehow nourish. That's why I haven't started.
So with that Game of Thrones imagery, I think we are right at the very end of the panel. So I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank the panelists here for their time and effort. There was a lot that went in behind the scenes in order to pull all this together. So thanks to you and to Kelly for making this a reality. And I hope everybody here got some useful information out of it. I want to encourage you to, at the end of the conference, fill in your surveys. As a member of the board of directors, I can tell you that we do read them, and we do take the advice and suggestions that are offered seriously. So please do fill them out at the end of the conference, not just for this session, but for all of them. And if you're interested in more information about some of this this topic, whether it's open access, whether it's read and publish, whether it's Plan S, there are a number of other sessions throughout the conference over the next couple of days that will address this. In fact, there's one that starts in 15 minutes over at the Francis Marion on read and publish in particular. So please take advantage of that and learn more, because you're going to want to participate in this and not let it just wash over you. So with that said, thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Adam.